Our generation remembers when Hollywood stars were untouchable, when marriages were sacred, when the word homewrecker could destroy a career overnight. Elizabeth Taylor lived through all of that in 1959, and what happened to her changed not just Hollywood, but how America talked about love, betrayal, and forgiveness. This is the scandal that invented modern celebrity culture, and it started with a plane crash nobody saw coming. What you're about to hear isn't just gossip from old magazines. These are the documented facts from court records, NBC archives, and Elizabeth's own voice recordings released in 2024. The truth about how Eddie Fisher went from Mike Todd's best friend to Elizabeth's biggest mistake, how Debbie Reynolds went from victim to survivor, and how the most hated woman in America eventually made peace with the woman whose life she supposedly destroyed. Because here's the twist nobody expected. Debbie and Elizabeth became friends again, and that reconciliation might be the most shocking part of all. Before we dive into this story, if you want to hear more untold Hollywood scandals like this, please subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you the real stories behind the legends, the scandals nobody talks about anymore, and the truth that makes history unforgettable. In 1957, Hollywood had two couples that seemed to embody everything perfect about American life. Eddie Fisher and Debbie Reynolds represented wholesome romance, the kind that mothers showed their daughters as proof that true love existed. Fisher was America's crooning sweetheart, his voice filling living rooms through television screens every week on his NBC variety show. Reynolds was the girl next door who danced into America's heart in Singin' in the Rain, her smile so genuine it felt like sunshine. They had two small children, Carrie and Todd, and photographers loved catching them at backyard barbecues, pushing strollers, being normal. They were normalcy wrapped in stardust. Then there was the other couple. Elizabeth Taylor and Mike Todd didn't do normal. Todd was a showman, a producer who thought big and loved bigger. He'd given Elizabeth something none of her previous husbands had managed: genuine partnership. She'd been married twice before him, first to hotel heir Nicky Hilton in a disaster that lasted months, then to British actor Michael Wilding in a union that felt more like friendship than fire. But Mike Todd was different. He made her laugh. He challenged her. He produced Around the World in 80 Days and won an Oscar, and Elizabeth stood beside him at the ceremony in 1957, her violet eyes blazing with pride that had nothing to do with her own fame. These two couples moved in the same circles. Hollywood wasn't as big as people imagined. Not really. Not when you reach the altitude where Elizabeth and Debbie lived. They attended the same parties, the same premieres, the same poolside gatherings in Beverly Hills where the champagne never stopped flowing, and everyone knew everyone's business. Eddie Fisher and Mike Todd became close friends, the kind of friendship that men form when they recognize ambition in each other. Debbie and Elizabeth weren't best friends, but they were friendly, the way women are when their husbands bond and social obligations create proximity. Nobody thought anything dangerous was brewing. Why would they? These were two stable marriages, two happy families, two couples who had everything. But Hollywood has a way of taking everything and turning it into nothing in the space of a single night. And for Elizabeth Taylor, that night came on March 22, 1958. Mike Todd named his private plane the Liz. He decorated it with her favorite colors, stocked it with her preferred champagne, made it a flying monument to his love for her. On March 22, 1958, that plane was scheduled to fly from Burbank to New York City, where Todd was set to receive the Showman of the Year award from the Friars Club. Elizabeth was supposed to be on that flight. She'd planned to go, packed her bags, prepared for another one of Mike's grand adventures. But at the last minute, she came down with a cold. Nothing serious, just enough to make flying uncomfortable, enough to make Mike insist she stay home and rest. He kissed her goodbye at their Beverly Hills mansion, told her he'd be back in a few days, and walked out the door. The plane never made it to New York. Over the mountains of New Mexico, near a town called Grants, the Liz encountered a storm. Investigators would later determine that ice formed on the wings, that visibility dropped to almost nothing, that the pilot made the decision to try to climb above the weather. The plane broke apart in midair. Everyone aboard died instantly: Mike Todd, his biographer Art Cohn, pilot Bill Verner, and co-pilot Tom Barclay. The wreckage scattered across the mountainside, and when rescue crews arrived, there was nothing left to save, only pieces to identify and collect. Elizabeth found out through a phone call. She was 26 years old, pregnant not with a child but with a grief so massive it threatened to swallow her whole. The woman who'd faced down studio executives, who'd commanded million-dollar salaries, who'd stared into camera lenses without flinching, completely fell apart. She couldn't eat, she couldn't sleep, she couldn't function. The funeral was a blur of black veils and camera flashes because even grief wasn't private when your name was Elizabeth Taylor. The press descended like vultures, and she stood there in Forest Lawn Cemetery, watching them lower Mike Todd into the ground, feeling like she was being buried with him. Standing beside her, holding her steady when her legs threatened to give out, was Eddie Fisher, Mike's best friend. The man who'd been at their wedding, at their dinner parties, who'd laughed at Mike's jokes and celebrated his Oscar win. Eddie stepped into the role of comforter without anyone asking him to. He made the phone calls Elizabeth couldn't make. He dealt with the studio executives who wanted to know about her filming schedule. He sat with her in that big empty Beverly Hills mansion that still smelled like Mike's cigars, and he listened when she needed to talk and stayed silent when words would have been intrusive. It seemed like friendship. It looked like loyalty. And at first that's exactly what it was. Debbie Reynolds understood why her husband was spending so much time with Elizabeth. Of course she did. This was tragedy, and Eddie was doing what any decent friend would do. Mike Todd had been Eddie's friend too, and grief shared is grief lessened, or so the saying goes. Debbie even visited Elizabeth herself, brought food that went uneaten, offered condolences that felt inadequate against the weight of Elizabeth's loss. Nobody questioned it. Nobody suspected. This was 1958, and people still believed that married men could comfort widowed women without anything improper happening. But grief does strange things to people. It creates a kind of intensity, a forced intimacy that can feel like connection when it's really just shared pain. Elizabeth wasn't looking for romance. She was looking for someone, anyone who could understand the magnitude of what she'd lost. And Eddie, sitting there night after night, started to confuse his own feelings. Was he helping Elizabeth because Mike would have wanted him to? Or was something else developing? Something neither of them wanted to name. The shift happened gradually, then suddenly. One night they were talking about Mike, remembering stories, keeping his memory alive through words. The next night the conversation had drifted to other things. Elizabeth's fears, Eddie's own marriage, the weight of fame, the loneliness that even crowded rooms couldn't cure. And then came the night when talking stopped being enough. Neither of them planned it. Neither of them wanted to be the kind of people who would betray Debbie, who would dishonor Mike's memory this way. But intention doesn't matter when you're already falling. By late summer of 1958, the rumors started. Small at first, just whispers in the Hollywood community. The kind of gossip that circulates at parties and disappears with the morning hangovers. But whispers have a way of becoming shouts when the subject is Elizabeth Taylor. Someone saw them having dinner alone. Someone else noticed Eddie's car parked outside Elizabeth's house at odd hours. Someone mentioned that Debbie seemed to be alone a lot lately, that Eddie's explanations for his absences were getting thinner, more transparent. Debbie tried to ignore it. She wanted to believe her husband, wanted to trust that his devotion to helping Elizabeth was purely platonic. They had 2 children together. They had a life together. Eddie Fisher wasn't the type to throw that away for a fling, was he? But the evidence kept mounting. The late nights turned into overnight absences. The phone calls became secretive. And then came the moment that shattered whatever illusions Debbie had left. She confronted Eddie directly, and instead of denying it, he broke down and confessed. He was in love with Elizabeth Taylor. He didn't mean for it to happen. But it had happened, and now he didn't know how to undo it. When the scandal broke publicly in September 1958, it exploded with a force that Hollywood had never seen before. This wasn't just celebrity gossip. This was a morality play. And America had very strong opinions about who was the villain. Debbie Reynolds, pregnant with grief and abandonment, became the symbol of the betrayed wife, the good woman destroyed by a seductress. And Elizabeth Taylor, she became the homewrecker, the scarlet woman, the beautiful monster who stole another woman's husband while pretending to grieve. The press had a field day. Newspaper headlines screamed about the scandal. Columnists like Hedda Hopper, who'd once fawned over Elizabeth's beauty, turned vicious. Magazine covers showed side-by-side photos. Debbie looking wholesome and wounded, Elizabeth looking glamorous and guilty. The narrative wrote itself, and it didn't matter that the truth was more complicated. America wanted a villain, and Elizabeth Taylor with her violet eyes and her history of marriages fit the role perfectly. Eddie Fisher's career began to crumble almost immediately. NBC, facing a wave of public backlash, canceled his television show in March 1959. Sponsors pulled their advertisements. Radio stations stopped playing his records. The man who'd been America's sweetheart crooner became America's most hated husband, and his association with Elizabeth Taylor turned from romantic to radioactive. He'd thrown away his marriage, his career, his public image, all for a woman who, as it would later become clear, never really loved him at all. But Elizabeth refused to hide. She'd spent her entire life in the spotlight, and she wasn't about to start apologizing for her choices now, even if those choices were destroying her reputation. When reporters ambushed her outside restaurants, she stared them down. When columnists called her a homewrecker, she issued a statement that became infamous. Eddie made his own choice. "I didn't steal anyone." It was defiant, it was honest, and it made America hate her even more, because women in 1958 weren't supposed to be defiant about destroying marriages. They were supposed to be ashamed. The hatred reached levels that seem almost unimaginable now. Elizabeth received death threats. Protesters showed up at her public appearances. Religious leaders condemned her from pulpits. She became a symbol of moral decay, proof that Hollywood was corrupting American values. The woman who'd been crowned the world's most beautiful was now the world's most despised, and the transformation happened in a matter of months. On May 12, 1959, Elizabeth Taylor and Eddie Fisher got married in a quick ceremony in Las Vegas. There was no grand celebration, no Hollywood guest list, no magazine spreads showing the happy couple. This was a wedding performed under siege, surrounded by controversy, blessed by nobody except the two people saying vows they would later regret. Debbie Reynolds, barely divorced, was home with her children, trying to explain to Carrie and Todd why Daddy wasn't coming home anymore. America was watching with judgment and disgust, and Elizabeth was standing at an altar, marrying a man she would later admit she never truly loved. Why did she do it? The answer is complicated and heartbreaking. In the tapes released in 2024, as part of the HBO documentary Elizabeth Taylor: The Lost Tapes, Elizabeth's own voice provides the explanation that makes everything make sense. She talks about the guilt, the overwhelming guilt of Mike Todd's death, how she'd been supposed to be on that plane, how she survived only because of a common cold, how every day after the crash felt like borrowed time, time she wasn't supposed to have. And Eddie Fisher, standing there in the wreckage of her grief, reminded her of Mike. They'd been friends, they'd been close. Eddie carried traces of Mike in his stories, in his memories, in the way he tried to fill the impossible void that Mike's death had created. "I never loved Eddie," Elizabeth admits in those tapes, her voice carrying the weight of decades. "I loved Mike. Eddie was just there." It's a brutal honesty, the kind that only comes with age and perspective. She married Eddie Fisher because she couldn't stand to be alone with her grief. She married him because the press was already calling her a homewrecker, so she might as well make it legitimate. She married him because at 26 years old, having already been married 3 times, she didn't know any other way to process loss except through another ring, another vow, another attempt to fill the emptiness. The marriage was doomed from the start. Elizabeth knew it. Eddie probably knew it too, though he tried to pretend otherwise. They went through the motions, the honeymoon period that felt more like a ceasefire, the public appearances where they smiled for cameras while dying inside, the attempts to build a life together on a foundation made of grief and scandal and other people's anger. Eddie tried to revive his career. Elizabeth prepared to film Cleopatra, the role that would define her and nearly kill her. And both of them avoided talking about the obvious truth. This wasn't a marriage, it was a mistake dressed up in wedding clothes. If America thought the Eddie Fisher scandal was shocking, they had no idea what was coming next. In 1961, Elizabeth traveled to Rome to begin filming Cleopatra, the most expensive movie ever made at that time. Eddie came with her, playing the role of supportive husband while his career continued its downward spiral. And then Richard Burton arrived on set to play Mark Antony, and everything Elizabeth thought she knew about passion, about scandal, about what it meant to truly want someone, got rewritten in a matter of weeks. The affair between Elizabeth and Burton made the Eddie Fisher scandal look quaint by comparison. This wasn't grief-driven comfort-seeking. This was raw, undeniable attraction, the kind that burns through wedding vows and destroys everything in its path. The press, already primed to hate Elizabeth, went into a feeding frenzy. She was doing it again, destroying another marriage, this time while still married herself. The Vatican denounced her. Congress members called for her films to be banned, and Elizabeth, caught between Eddie Fisher and Richard Burton, chose the fire over the ashes. Eddie Fisher found out about the affair the way everyone else did, through newspaper headlines. The man who'd left Debbie Reynolds for Elizabeth Taylor was now being left by Elizabeth Taylor for someone else. The symmetry was almost poetic, if poetry could be this cruel. He tried to fight for the marriage, tried to win her back, but you can't compete with the kind of chemistry that Elizabeth and Burton had. In 1964, Elizabeth divorced Eddie Fisher and married Richard Burton, beginning one of Hollywood's most legendary and tumultuous relationships. For Eddie, it was the final humiliation. He'd destroyed his marriage to Debbie, destroyed his career, destroyed his reputation, all for a woman who'd never really wanted him. He was collateral damage in Elizabeth Taylor's journey from grief to passion, a stepping stone between two great loves, Mike Todd and Richard Burton. History would remember him not for his music or his talent, but as the man Elizabeth Taylor married by mistake. Here's where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. Years passed, decades. Actually, Elizabeth went on to marry Richard Burton twice, divorcing him both times in a cycle of passion and destruction that defined the 1960s and 70s. She married more times after that. John Warner, Larry Fortensky, adding to the total until she'd walked down the aisle 8 times. Debbie Reynolds rebuilt her life, raised her children including Carrie Fisher, who would become Princess Leia and a brilliant writer in her own right, and carried the badge of America's sweetheart with dignity and grace. And then something extraordinary happened. Elizabeth and Debbie found their way back to friendship. It didn't happen overnight. It took years of both women growing, maturing, understanding that what happened in 1958 was more complicated than villain and victim, homewrecker and saint. Debbie, in interviews, began to soften her stance. She talked about how Eddie Fisher had made his own choices, how holding on to anger was exhausting, how life was too short to waste on decades-old grudges. Elizabeth reached out first, according to Debbie's account. It was tentative, a phone call that could have gone either way. But Debbie answered, and they talked, really talked for the first time since the scandal. They found common ground in motherhood, in survival, in the shared experience of being women who'd lived their lives under impossible scrutiny. They discovered that time and perspective had given them both a clearer view of what had really happened. 2 people caught in grief, 1 person making terrible choices, and a media circus that turned private pain into public spectacle. They eventually took a cruise together, shared meals, laughed about things that once would have been too painful to mention. Debbie even joked about it in her later years, saying that Elizabeth apologized and that was enough. The reconciliation shocked the public almost as much as the original scandal had. How could Debbie forgive the woman who stole her husband? The answer, Debbie explained, was simple. Because holding on to hate was harder than letting it go. Elizabeth Taylor died in 2011 at the age of 79. By then she'd become far more than the sum of her scandals. She was a 2-time Oscar winner, a successful businesswoman with a perfume empire, and most importantly, an AIDS activist who'd raised hundreds of millions of dollars for research and care. When Rock Hudson died of AIDS in 1985, Elizabeth used her fame and her fortune to force America to pay attention to a crisis it had been ignoring. She founded AMFAR, the American Foundation for AIDS Research, and she fought for funding, for compassion, for an end to the stigma that was killing people as surely as the disease itself. It was this work, not her beauty or her marriages, that she wanted to be remembered for. Debbie Reynolds died in 2016, just 1 day after her daughter Carrie Fisher's sudden death. The grief of losing Carrie was too much for Debbie's heart to bear, and she followed her daughter into death with a swiftness that seemed almost intentional. At her memorial service, people remembered her resilience, her talent, her ability to survive betrayal and build a life that mattered, and they remembered her capacity for forgiveness, the grace she showed in reconciling with Elizabeth Taylor. Eddie Fisher died in 2010. His career and reputation never fully recovered from the scandals that had defined him. He wrote a memoir, tried to explain his side of the story, but history had already written its verdict. He would forever be the man who left Debbie Reynolds for Elizabeth Taylor and then lost Elizabeth Taylor to Richard Burton. The scandal that erupted in 1958 changed Hollywood in ways that are still visible today. It was the first time that celebrity private lives became public entertainment on such a massive scale. The paparazzi culture, the tabloid feeding frenzies, the way we consume and judge celebrity relationships, all of it traces back to that moment when Elizabeth Taylor and Eddie Fisher's affair became front-page news. Before them, Hollywood had scandals, but they were usually hushed up, managed by studio publicity departments, kept behind closed doors. Elizabeth and Eddie's scandal kicked those doors wide open, and they never closed again. Looking back now, with the perspective of decades and the benefit of Elizabeth's own recorded confessions, the story becomes more tragic than scandalous. A young woman, barely out of her 20s, drowning in grief so profound she couldn't function. A man who mistook proximity for love and destroyed his life for it. Another man who was already dead but whose ghost haunted every decision Elizabeth made. And a woman, Debbie Reynolds, who survived being cast as the victim and emerged with her dignity intact and her heart open enough to forgive. The Eddie Fisher scandal wasn't really about stolen love or home-wrecking. It was about grief, desperation, bad timing, and the crushing weight of fame. It was about how the public creates narratives that may have nothing to do with truth, about how judgment from strangers can destroy lives, about how forgiveness is harder and more important than revenge. Elizabeth Taylor carried the label of homewrecker for decades, wore it like a scarlet letter she refused to hide. But in the end, she and Debbie both transcended the scandal that had defined them. They became friends again, proving that people are more complex than the worst things they've done, and that grace is always an option if we're brave enough to choose it. This is the story our generation remembers because we lived through it, watched it unfold in real time, formed our opinions, and then, if we were wise, reconsidered them. We learned that Hollywood marriages are built on foundations far more fragile than they appear. We learned that beautiful people make ugly mistakes just like everyone else. And we learned that sometimes the most shocking thing isn't the scandal itself, but the forgiveness that comes after. Elizabeth Taylor and Debbie Reynolds both left legacies that matter. Elizabeth's AIDS activism saved countless lives. Debbie's resilience inspired generations of women to survive and thrive despite betrayal. The scandal that once seemed to define them became just one chapter in much longer, richer stories. And Eddie Fisher, the man caught between them, serves as a reminder that you can lose everything chasing something that was never real to begin with. The violet-eyed goddess who became the world's most hated woman, and the sweetheart who found the strength to forgive her. That's the real story of 1958. Not a simple tale of good versus evil, but a complicated truth about human frailty, terrible choices, and the redemptive power of time and grace.